Hi, I'm Suzanne McGurn, President and CEO of CADTH. Welcome to CADTH in Conversation With, a show where I talk to Canadian and global leaders in healthcare, value assessment, and health technology management. Today, I'm so pleased to welcome Professor Gillian Leng. Gillian is the Chief Executive of the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, better known as NICE. Gillian is widely admired for her contributions to England's National Health Service, and in 2011 was named a Commander of the Order of the British Empire. For those unfamiliar with NICE, it is England's National Health Technology Assessment Agency. It is globally respected for its health technology appraisals, evidence-based guidelines, scientific methods, and so much more. When it comes to health technology decision-making in Canada, a common question I hear is, what has NICE recommended, or how is NICE handling this issue? Well, today we'll find out. I'll be talking to Gillian about NICE's new 5-year strategic plan and what it means for the future of value assessment in a world that has changed dramatically because of COVID-19. Gillian, welcome. Thank you for being my first guest.
Pleased to be here.
As you know, I have a long list of questions for you. The work that your organization does is of interest to us here in Canada and around the world. I'm hoping that we will make it through them all and that we'll open things up to questions from the audience. So let's get started. I have to admit, I feel a kind of kindred spirit with you, as you and I have something uniquely in common. We both became executives of respected health technology agencies amid a global pandemic. You recently passing the 1-year mark, and mine just around the corner. I guess my first question maybe is, I'm curious about what drew you to this job at this point in your career. And I suspect the first year hasn't been quite as you planned. What would you like to share with us about what year one has been like?
Good point indeed. My first year wasn't at all as I'd planned. You know, most people taking on a chief executive role will have this first 100 days concept and think about what I was going to do in those first 100 days, and it didn't turn out at all as I'd planned. However, first of all, you asked me, why did I take this job at NICE? And the short answer to that is that I really care about using evidence to support best practice in healthcare. And that goes back a long way to when I was a junior doctor, and I recognized there was quite a lot of variation in the care that was being provided. So I really care about that. I've worked at NICE for many years, and I wanted to be able to take the organization forward, both in its work on guidelines and HTA. So that's why I took the job. But the first year was rather surprising. There was all of the work that we suddenly had to do to respond to the pandemic. And that, in many ways, has been quite a positive catalyst. Perhaps we'll come on to it shortly, but some of the things that we were asked to do as a result of the pandemic in terms of guidelines, etc., was really positive. We were also, of course, suddenly working from home. So the organization that I thought I'd be working in with doors and windows and a physical space didn't exist. So we had to adapt to that. We were also developing a new strategy and doing a very significant review of our methods and processes for health technology evaluation, which is still ongoing. So an awful lot of things happening in a rather odd virtual world.
Well, I'm certainly glad to know I wasn't the only one whose 100-day plan as originally outlined didn't come to fruition. And I must say, you have the added value of having met your staff is something that I haven't yet had. So, and you alluded to your strategic plan. So maybe let's spend a little bit of time talking about it. I've certainly followed your organization's work during the past year as you've been creating your new strategic plan. No small task, as you've just said, during a pandemic and new to this role. You launched the plan a little over a month ago, virtually, of course, to what I believe is a live audience of about 3,000 individuals. And I was one of the Canadians up and watching in the very early AM, just like a royal wedding. And I will talk to you more about some of the specifics as we move through the interview this morning. But I wonder if you could share what, the highlights of that plan are for you.
Very happy to share some of the highlights. The structure of the strategic plan is formed around 4 pillars. So rapid responsive health technology evaluation, dynamic living guidelines, uptake of the guidance that we produce, obviously absolutely key. No point producing anything if it's not used. And the future use of real world data in the work that we do. So within those 4 pillars, lots of different elements, and perhaps some of the highlights are that piece that's about being rapid and responsive, because NICE's reputation that we've built over the last 20 years is about being the gold standard. It's being robust and solid and reliable, and those things are clearly very, very important. However, with the variety of new technologies, new types of medicines, digital products that we're expecting to come forward over the next few years, with that variety of things, we need to be more flexible and adaptable in the way that we look at those products. So that's easy to say, flexible and adaptable, but quite a big change to the way we work. And part of working in a different way is about using real world data. When NICE was established 20 years ago or so, most of the research was all formal research. That was the way things were done in those days. A gradual, real increase in the availability of real world data since then, and some products, particularly digital ones, they inherently collect that data as they're being used. So we need to adapt to be able to take that into account in our work. So that's a couple of things about how we work, but there's also what we do within this too, and just picking out a couple of things. One is to develop more our approach to evaluating digital technologies, because there's such a lot of them coming through. We need to be able to help the system to see what represents good value for money. So we're just opening something we're calling an Office for Digital Health, which is it's not walls and a door office, obviously. However, it is a metaphorical front door so that people interested in what we're doing around evaluating digital products know where to go and who to ask about how we're taking that forwards. And one key part about adoption of our recommendations is the transition from an assessment of a technology rapidly into a guideline. Guidelines tend to be what practitioners use in their day-to-day practice. And if we have a long lag between something being recommended in a piece of technology assessment guidance to get into the guideline, it doesn't help uptake. So we want that to be a seamless transition into a guideline that is a living guideline rather than an intermittently updated guideline.
Thanks so much in your response. We're going to touch on as we go through, but the one thing you did reflect on that I think is really important is your pillar about how to communicate. So I do, really see value in that. One of the other things that I found really unique about your strategic plan was it wasn't just about the where you wanted to go, it was about how you needed to get there. And your strategic plan laid down a clear need for internal transformation of your organization as a key success factor. I'm curious, about what you mean. I know our organizations do some similar core functions, but we're very different in size and magnitude. And with your organization of almost 700 employees, how does a body like NICE, and perhaps by extension, many other HTA bodies, think about how we need to transform to be able to do our work to meet the needs of the future?
That's a really good question, because it is key to making some of these changes happen, as I was describing, greater flexibility and responsiveness. How do we build that in to the way we work? Probably the same as you. We are a process-driven organization, because having a clear process is what underpins our work and helps external parties know what we're doing, when we're doing it, and how they engage with us. So there's a number of pieces to the transformation, one of which is obvious in a way, easy to say, but not so easy to do. It's an internal digital workplace transformation. Thus, more efficient, by and large, and to store data in a more accessible way. So after 20 years, we look back at the way we're working, and of course it's evolved from how it started out 20 years ago. However, there are a number of things that we could do much more efficiently by introducing modern digital technology. For instance, we spend a lot of time looking at people's conflicts of interest on our committees, as I'm sure you do. Almost 1,500 of those forms get completed in our technology appraisal program each year, and they're all manually assessed and they're put manually onto a spreadsheet and updated. So it's an example of many other processes that we've put in place that we could have seamlessly done or in an automatic way once we've made best use of new digital technology. And of course, digital technology doesn't change things on its own. You have to retrain staff, you have to get them to work in different ways, but it will be a more efficient organisation. There's other things we want to look at, like how we use committees. How do we make best use of their time compared with time that the teams are spending looking at evidence and submissions. There's one more thing I'll mention, and that's the culture of the organisation. Now, I think the staff at NICE are fantastic. They really care about what they do. They work hard. They are committed. All sorts of wonderful things. However, there is a bit of a transition we need to make in the culture to this more flexible way of working, because we have robust processes, and it's a bit like turning a tank around, isn't it? This is what we do. And if we want to change it a little bit, you have to think about the culture and the way people work, and perhaps empower people more to make decisions at levels where they aren't used to making decisions. So some sort of softer, if you like, adaptation that we need to make alongside structural things like digital technology.
What a great answer. And I have to say, just in some of the language of that you've used already, the metaphor for the front door, your strategic plan talks about the lit runway for industry to be able to interact with your organization. And as you're talking about your own internal work, really turning the skills that our organizations have for appraisal on ourselves and looking forward to how do we make ourselves our best new self. So really appreciate that being built into the strategic plan. One of the other things that comes through loud and clear as part of your strategic plan is that, and it resonates with something I say, relationships matter. So I was very intrigued by your strategic plan's emphasis on reshaping relationships with industry, patients, patient groups. Can you talk a bit more about what you'd like to see these relationships evolve to, and perhaps reflect on whether there was any concern as part of your strategic development or since your launch that suggested that a more open relationship with these groups could have a negative impact on the robust independence of that NICE's work is known for?
Both industry stakeholders and patients and patient groups are core to the way we work now. So during every appraisal, there's engagement with industry at set points, engagement with patient organizations. So that's all good and generally works well. Clearly, sometimes there's tension depending on the outcome of the assessments that we're doing. However, in relation to the reshaping of that relationship, it's more about having an ongoing strategic relationship with both those groups. So for instance, we are aware that industry colleagues have a huge amount of knowledge and insight into things that are being developed, things in the pipeline. So to help us make sure we are ready to deal with some of those things, we feel we should have an ongoing strategic relationship with core industry partners to help us understand what's coming down the track and to be ready to address them. That's one example. The industry also does a lot of work with real world data, and if we want to be able to evaluate it, conversations and links with them about what they're thinking, what they might be able to produce, how it might be shaped, are clearly very important. And patient groups clearly, again, there are strategic conversations as well as the detailed ones around products that we're actively assessing. And again, there is an element of data and what matters to patients in the way that we might be looking at research in the future, looking at data. And at some point in future, I'd like us to have a facility on our guidance pages where we can take ongoing feedback from patients and patient groups. That's how we're all used to engaging with the internet, isn't it? Really, you can review this, that, and the other. It would be good to be able to have some real-time engagement with patients and patient groups. But there's one more particular aspect that I could just mention, and that's called a project we're calling Nice Listens. We used to have something called the Citizens Council to get a more public perspective on some of the ethical considerations around our work, and that hasn't been in operation for a while now, and we're reinvigorating that engagement with the public as opposed to specific patient groups over the next few months. We've got some key questions we want to test, and the first piece is going to be around health inequalities and what the public thinks about that, what they think the ethical considerations are, and of course how that might link to NICE's work. So lots of things going on.
I have lots to learn and lots of similarities as well. And I just want to remind the audience, you're more than welcome to submit questions as we move along, and we'll try and get to those at the end. But Gillian, you talked a little bit about real world evidence already, and it is very much growing in our ecosystem. It features prominently in your strategic plan, almost is an underpinning of your fourth pillar. It's something that we're really trying to turn our attention to in a thoughtful and proactive way here at CADTH. I guess what will real world evidence and the life cycle approach to HTA and value assessment look like for NICE in the future? I know it's already a function similar to others that you do now, but you're envisioning it being something more. Can you talk a little bit about what that would be?
The easiest place to start is probably with the current Cancer Drugs Fund that we have here, because that is a way of drawing real world evidence for particular cancer drugs that we then take back and we evaluate. Now, that's quite a managed approach to real world evidence, but by which I mean we do an initial assessment of cancer drugs. If they look promising, but the evidence base isn't complete, they're approved, and we recommend data collection as they're being used on real patients, and then we look at that. So that's quite managed, and that managed approach to collecting real world evidence is something we'd like to expand to other scenarios, as we have an innovative medicines fund replacing the Cancer Drugs Fund, for instance, and for medical technologies too. Increasingly, we think that sort of promising but not proven approach would work well for medical technologies. So that's us managing the collection of real world evidence. However, of course, there are a number of scenarios where the real world evidence might be the first thing that we see, rather than something we've particularly asked for in a defined context. So there needs to be quite a bit of work done in the background, which we initiated a year or so ago, to identify what sort of standards, what sort of quality of that real world data would we expect for us to be able to consider it. And the interesting question is when might real world evidence trump a randomized controlled trial? Lots of controversies around that. How do you take the bias out of the real world data? But really important questions, because some of the technologies that are coming through will be inherently collecting that data, and we need to be ready to use it in a robust way. So it's quite exciting, and there's lots to do. We've set up a new directorate at NICE called the Science, Evidence and Analytics Directorate, and their main role really is helping us with this and that analysis of that data. it's been collected in all sorts of different ways, isn't it? And just today I was reading in the news about Google partnering with an international healthcare provider to collect data from patient records and using that to develop algorithms for patient care. And you begin to think, how does that all come together? What does it mean? And how do we assess it? So lots to do.
Yeah, I think your comment about it both being exciting and filled with controversy are key messages. And there's just so much opportunity. The data is there that we've been collecting for years, and now to figure out how to harness its abilities to help us to do better assessments and make better recommendations. In your opening remarks, you talked about sort of COVID and the pandemic upending things. And I think one of the other things you talked a little bit about was the how we do our job. And when I first started, I think one of the first events I went to, the fundamental question being asked about the methodologies and processes that we all use to do our HTA was about the trade-off conversation between quality and speed. But as I listened to your launch, I actually thought I heard something different. I thought I heard you reflecting on a future where speed and rigor would go hand in hand. And from your extensive experience, what should decision makers expect from us in the very near, hopefully post-COVID world in that sort of quality and timeliness environment?
It's really important, isn't it? We live in a world where things generally seem to be speeding up. People don't want to wait. They expect to be ordering something online, and it not just to come tomorrow, but to come today. At least that's what it's like. That's what it's like here. So people expect things to happen quickly, and the pandemic very much did speed up things in the UK. It increased the speed dramatically that we managed to get the randomized controlled trial in place. And then from going from the trial evidence to evaluating that to getting information out and getting it used was dramatically faster than it would have been in a pre-COVID world. And NICE was part of a collaboration that is still ongoing, that runs from the research end through to the regulators, to NICE, to assess and research products and get them into the system. So we want to carry on doing that. We want to keep this compressed timeline. However, it means working harder at the collaboration, and it means thinking about processes so you can do things in parallel rather than in sequence. And you mentioned robustness of process. Clearly, people expect to be able to trust us. And so if we're making headroads into speed, we have to be very careful that we are not shaving things off the quality of our assessment and putting anybody at risk.
Yeah, well, it really is an interesting conundrum. There's so much opportunity for evidence, I say, generally, in what we've seen during COVID. One of the things that you also touched on earlier was the issue of inequities in healthcare. I think we all know that they've been there, and I know that there's, at least here in Canada, we've talked about the inequities for years. But the world events of the last year, plus the pandemic, has certainly put a spotlight on them in a way that we really can't ignore. And I really do feel the conversation is changing. Your strategy emphasizes prioritizing work to reduce health equities. I guess I'm interested in, what does that look like for NICE over the next 5 years? And how do we, where we're often responding to what people bring to us, devices or drugs, how do we make sure that those developers are looking forward to how to emphasize issues of equality? So no short task. And I know that there's 2 or 3 questions come in about the issue of inequality. So really interested in your vision on this topic.
It's a really important topic, isn't it? And aiming to reduce health inequalities through NICE's work is one of our core principles that's been there for many, many years. And it is reflected in our core methods and processes now. However, with this renewed emphasis on health inequalities because of what we've seen during the pandemic, we want to take another look and see if there's more that we can do. It's helpfully also a priority of the UK government too, and they describe it very clearly as the levelling up agenda. which is an important point to make because it indicates we want to reduce health inequalities by improvement rather than sort of reducing everyone to some sort of middle level. So what are we doing to see whether there's more we can do? There are a number of things that we're looking at. Starting at one end, say, it's checking what topics we're looking at, be that a technology or a guideline. Are there things that we might select more than others because inherently they are likely to improve health inequalities? Then there's a complicated bit around our methods and how we might adjust those or not. For instance, would we ever weight a QALY because it had a positive effect on inequalities? We don't have that in as a factor at the moment, but we might. And then, of course, at the other end, there's how things are put into practice, which we don't have a direct responsibility for. However, we know it clearly can make a difference because if things that improve health are implemented better in relation to, say, areas of affluence or areas of better health, that will make inequalities worse. So we are working with system partners to think about that aspect of things, how things are implemented. However, the bit in the middle around our methods and processes, that's quite tricky. I mentioned nice listens, so that's about engaging with the public, but we're also thinking that we need to commission a piece of expert research around this because it's complicated, and we don't think there's an obvious answer, but it would be definitely worth having some big brains looking at it on our behalf to see if we might change what we do and how we do it.
Well, it's certainly something I think we can all learn from. And I think all of us need to be very thoughtful about it because it is a place I think we have a huge opportunity to make a difference. As you just answered that question, you reflected on the role of clinical practice guidelines. And as we talked about in our previous brief chat, at CADTH, the clinical practice guidelines are not part of our remit. So I'm quite interested if you could share a bit about the value of the guidelines work at NICE to your overall ability to impact moving evidence to action within your healthcare system. And there have actually been a couple of questions that have come in, so I'll mention it as well. A question about how do your guidelines fit with those that may be done with the societies and clinical specialist groups. And you do talk in the strategy about more rapidly updating your guidelines. And I think you touched on it at the beginning with sort of as technology assessments are done, moving them in. And of course, everyone likes to quantify things. So how fast is fast? So if you could share a little bit about the guidelines work with this, that we'd really appreciate it.
We probably have the biggest guideline production program in the world. We have now almost 400 guidelines, and developing a guideline is a big piece of work. By the time you've synthesized all the evidence and made sense of it, produced practical recommendations, and it's quite a challenge to keep all of that up to date. However, it is really important. So one of your questions, I think, was what's the impact of that been? Well, the impact is pretty fundamental because healthcare and the training of medical students and other health professionals very much is underpinned by NICE guidelines. I used to teach medical students over the years, and many moons ago, of course, they didn't know anything about NICE. Then they'd be a bit suspicious. My consultant doesn't believe it. That sort of response. But now NICE guidelines are very much seen as best practice that should be followed, and indeed things like the General Medical Council would expect doctors to be following guidelines. So they are really important, and therefore important that they're up to date, with new technologies that we approve. It helps the implementation if the technologies are reflected in the care pathway in the guideline. You asked how fast is fast in terms of rapidly updating. We're using the expression living guidelines, and that at its best, it would mean that as soon as a new piece of evidence comes out, it is then reflected in the underpinning evidence base so that anyone can go to the guideline and think, yep, they've looked at that evidence, it's all there. Our first real foray into producing a living guideline is the guidelines that we have in place for COVID. And that's a great example because, of course, the evidence base is developing very, very rapidly. And it's very, very important that practitioners know that our guidelines are up to date. So that's a really good example, but it is resource intensive. So we need to think about the speed of change of the evidence base across the board for our guidelines in future. And we will have to prioritize the guidelines that we maintain to this level. So we can't keep 400 guidelines up to date in that way. That's one thing. And the other thing is it needs a really good underpinning digital platform to make it easy to do that. And we're currently experimenting with a number of different platforms. I think you asked what's the role for guidelines developed by specialist societies, didn't you? Well, I think they will have a really important role. We have in the past accredited guidelines from professional societies that reach a good standard. So they have a kite mark from NICE. And as we have to consider which of this portfolio of 400-ish guidelines we can maintain, working with other guideline developers and work so that the gaps that we can't keep up to date are picked up elsewhere will be a really important part of that strategy and that approach for the future. Because as I say, there's so much evidence, isn't there? There's so much evidence. Individual clinicians can't keep up to date with it. And the role of the guideline has become really crucial to healthcare.
Yeah. And I know that the work that we all do in our day jobs is really most important when it's put into practice. So finding the right way to get information into practice is critical. There's been a few questions along this line in the Q's and A's. So a little bit about international cooperation and how to reduce duplication. Certainly one of the side effects of the pandemic is that there has been increased cooperation. I've seen it across Canada. I've seen it internationally. But sometimes that increased, cooperation comes along with some confusion as well. What should the public think when we're making different determinations on the same products? And that confusion extends from a wide variety of whether it's vaccines or pharmaceuticals or technologies. So in your viewpoint, what are the prospects going forward for more alignment and cooperation among HTA agencies? And do you have thoughts about where we should potentially consider pooling our resources or leveraging our relationships differently in an effort to both be able to respond to the new demands that are being placed on us, but also to maybe increase the consistency across our various organizations?
I think increasing collaboration for the future is going to be really important. I've talked already about the volume of new technologies that we know are in development, whether that's medicines or whether that's medtech or digital. There's a lot more things that are coming through, and I can't see any of us having the capacity to really keep up with all of that without actively collaborating. There are different levels of collaboration, of course, aren't there? The pinnacle, I suppose, is a full-blown joint piece of work where things are jointly badged, jointly owned. I think in most of the HTA world, we won't get to that level. And that's because the health technology assessment is inherently about the priorities of local healthcare systems and how they wish to spend their money and how the healthcare systems are organized and funded. All those things come into play. And those things are probably why we've seen the variation in adoption of vaccines. However, beneath that pinnacle of collaboration, there are other things that we really can support, and that's things like methods that we use, developing some of these difficult ways of looking at digital products, perhaps, of coming up with more common approaches to evidence assessment, common frameworks, common submission forms, say, for industry and others to use to make it all more efficient, possibly sharing some of that data. If we begin to align more around how things are done and how the data is collected, much more easy, much more straightforward to share and use that data, even if the actual value-based judgment is made more locally, we could at least share some of the underpinning resource.
Thanks for that. And I'm really looking forward to opportunities that our organizations will have to work together in the coming months and years. I'm going to turn my attention to some of the questions. There's some great questions that have come in to us. One of them harkens back to your opening comments about digital evolution. And one of the questions that's been asked is, do you think there's critical components of assessment of digital health technologies that differ from what we traditionally think of as traditional device HTA? And any thoughts about sort of the digital future?
It's really complicated, I think, is my short answer to that. And I won't claim to be an expert. There is an awful lot of work going on at the moment within NICE and with other partners in our healthcare system. It's complicated because digital products work in all sorts of different ways. The categorization of them has been quite challenging, and that's a piece of work that NICE led a few years ago to set up a framework for different types of technologies, so that as an HTA body we won't need to assess all of them. There are those with highest risks, those that are most closely related to healthcare, that we need to focus on. But then there's different ways that they work. As I say, they can evolve, they can learn, they can have AI built into them, they can be linked with medicines, they can be linked with monitoring, and they can collect data. So it's complicated because it's not a fixed thing. It's not a chemical entity like with a drug. And it was a couple of years ago now, so things will, of course, have moved on. And yet, 2 years ago, held a really interesting workshop with a range of academics and, of course, a range of views about the evaluation of digital. Some people saying that they were very similar to what we do now and we should stick with a randomized controlled trial model for those things that were really important, and others saying, no, there are more fluid approaches that we might be able to use building on real world data. So it's those sorts of thorny issues that we are currently working on.
Yeah, I would agree. It's certainly, it's not the same, but there's certainly a lot of what we've learned over the history of HTA that I think can be brought to bear, and it's finding out how to make it work well together. One of the things that, has come up often, and it's come up at international meetings, it's come up within the media, it's come up, I think, in all of our day jobs, is the issue of trust and how trust in experts and information sources has changed in the course of the pandemic. And in some ways, it's alarming about what it looks like. There was a really good question that came in about, how does NICE envision organizing and packaging the wealth of emerging information in a way that the public can find it, can rely on it, and be able to have confidence in it? So any observations that you have from your vantage point across the way about the issue of trust and getting the right information, particularly out to the public?
It's really important, isn't it? Without trust, one is lost, I think. After 20 years, NICE has built up a reputation for being robust and being trusted, and that's all good, but we can't take that for granted. And I mentioned earlier, conflicts of interest. That is one way that trust can be eroded very, very quickly, I think, if people become suspicious of those that you're working with. So we will retain that as absolutely central. In terms of getting information to the public, our website is very open. There's all sorts of stuff there. However, it's probably not as accessible to the general public as it might be. So as we move forwards and we think about our presentation for the future, I'm keen to get to a model of a digital interactive guideline. If we focus on the guideline for a moment, although the same principles apply in many ways to an HTA assessment, a model where you have a straightforward top line recommendation, but then you can drill down and get more information, more detail about the evidence if you want to. And importantly for patients, I think, is being able to see key information about the product, be it a drug or diagnostic test, that compares it with other options, shows you what the benefits are, shows you what the risks are, impact on life expectancy, say, to help that decision making, to help patients with shared decision making. So if we can build that in too, that would be brilliant.
One last question. We're almost out of time. And it has to do with sort of life cycle management of technologies. I think we recognize that the origins of HTA has come from probably the front end, the access end, where HTA was an access hurdle. But over the last number of years, as life cycle management has unfolded, I think the one thorny issue that we all continue to struggle with is late stage technology. So the decommissioning of technologies or pharmaceuticals. I think a lot of countries look to you about the experience you've had to date, and wonder if there's anything that you would share as sort of key learnings about being able to manage through the life cycle, including the decommissioning.
Yes, decommissioning, that is the tricky piece of the puzzle, isn't it? And lots of ways that we've looked at that over the years. One way was to have a specific referral to NICE to look at things that were generally considered not effective and should be decommissioned. So somebody done some prior thinking, said to NICE, why don't you look at this? Grommets was an example. Lots of time and effort spent looking at grommets. And at the end of the day, there wasn't a black and white answer. There was well, it's probably not useful in most people, but in this group it is. And that's the example that sticks in my mind. But the other examples all came down to a sort of, well, yes, but. And it was quite a complicated piece of work. I'm afraid I'm going to talk about guidelines again, because it's guidelines where we've had more success in identifying things that shouldn't happen. And that's because the guideline gives you the overall picture of care in a particular pathway. So in future, let's hope that by rapidly moving a new technology into the guideline, that gives a group of people who we will need to have as a standing committee for a guideline to say, whoa, well, if this bit's coming in here, that means we shouldn't need the other. And it's only by having that group of people, I think, who are experts and think about the overall pathway, that we will really be able to spot those decommissioning elements, because it's not always straightforward to embed new technologies in the system to get change to happen. However, it's also really quite hard to stop doing things too. So at the moment, we are identifying things to stop through our guidelines program, and then we're working with other parts of the system who then help drive through a program of stopping those activities.
Gillian, I can't thank you enough for the time you've spent with us today. We're almost out of time, and we have to wrap up this conversation. But maybe any final comments you'd like to share with the audience before we sign off?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's been a great conversation. There are lots and lots of key areas of common interest between what we're doing in the UK and what's happening in Canada, and it's a collaboration that I'm really pleased to have in place, and I look forward to continuing to work with you.
That's a wrap on this episode of CADTH in Conversation With. Thanks for joining me. And remember, you can listen and subscribe to our show anywhere you find your podcasts. To learn more about CADTH's role in Canadian healthcare and the work we do, visit our website at cadth.ca. That's CADTH.ca. See you next time.